Good afternoon. I'm David Luberoff, the Joint Center's Director of Fellowships and Events, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar, which is the last in our spring semester series, Housing Research Seminar series. Today's talk, of course, is on housing resilience in the years since Katrina struck New Orleans and the surrounding communities. As I said, this is the last of our spring seminars. The next Joint Center event will be sometime in mid to late June when we release our annual State of the Nation's Housing Report. We have not yet set that date, so watch your emails and our website for information on that. Today's talk is special. We actually have three speakers today. Carlos Martin, who directs the Center's Remodeling Futures program, and Claudia Solari, a senior research associate at the Urban Institute's Metropolitan Housing and Communities Policy Center. Carlos and Claudia will be talking about key findings from housing resilience in Greater New Orleans, a report that they and others co-authored that was published earlier this year by the Urban Institute. After they speak, we'll have a brief response from Carolyn Kousky, Associate Vice President for Economics and Policy Analysis at the Environmental Defense Fund, who was a key advisor to that project, particularly on issues related to insurance, which you will learn more about. After Carolyn speaks, we'll move to a Q&A. As always, feel free to drop your questions into Zoom's Q&A feature. We will curate those. Apologies in advance if we don't get to your questions, given the size of the audience and the length of the presentation. We'll get to some of them, but we will share those with the speakers, and in some cases, they may want to respond to you. We'll end right around 1 p.m. Video of this event and the slides will be posted on the event website on the Joint Center's webpage by early next week. I guess we're going to start with you, Carlos. It's all yours.
Why, thank you, sir. Thank you very much, David. It's been such a joy bringing a climate portfolio to the Joint Center for Housing Studies over the last couple of years. And so I do want to acknowledge that I think we've done at least one public event each term in this space. So I'm happy that the release of this report can contribute to this time around. And speaking of timing, I realized just this morning that we unwittingly scheduled this webinar for the onset of Earth Day weekend. So I find it fitting that we're speaking about home resilience at a time when we should be commemorating our home planet. But that also brings me to an important prologue that I find myself repeating every time I do a presentation now on climate adaptation and housing. The findings that Dr. Solari and I will be presenting come from a multi-year study focused on existing homes in relationship to climate change's effects. In simple terms, we're talking about climate adaptation. However, there is one very fundamental way in which we can fully prepare our existing and future housing communities from future damages and losses. And I'm referring to climate mitigation, including the mass decarbonization of existing homes. We can stop or at least decelerate the escalation of further risk. And we would be remiss if we didn't mention that reducing our housing's reliance on fossil fuels should be among the first steps taken as we simultaneously address the effects from climate change that we are already seeing. So more on that in future webinars. I promise we have been doing a lot on climate mitigation and energy use in the housing stock that we'll talk about in the future. But let me come back once more to this issue of timing, since in essence, our study's motivation is about how housing disparities in relationships to climate risks evolved in a single point in time in a specific place, and how that information can shed light on the challenges we will be facing in every corner of this country in the next 2 decades if we aren't already facing them already. In our case, that time is the decade following Hurricane Katrina up to 2018, and our place is southeastern Louisiana. Katrina in August 2005 was transformative for New Orleans, for the entire New Orleans region for many reasons, not only in the core fact that 800 people died and $125 billion in damages was witnessed. It led to significant confusion regarding repairs and recovery and in realty transactions, including those that involved the state and federal government's road home programs, as well as the slew of charities who came to do home repairs and home debris clean out after the fact. It in turn led to all of that activity led to disparities in recovery, often due to the presence or absence of insurance, of appropriate insurance, as well as pre-storm home qualities and value, and the racial composition of the neighborhoods in which homes stood. One critical example of how these disparities manifested was led by a partner of ours on this very project. Now, the Louisiana Fair Housing Action Center, then the Greater New Orleans Fair Housing Action Center, who settled a class action lawsuit on behalf of Black homeowners with the federal and state governments in 2011 because the public recovery programs based eligibility for household recovery on pre-Katrina home values rather than the cost of simple repairs. Finally, Katrina also led to a demographic pivot for the region that still plays out today, as documented by another of our long-term partners and a good partner on this study, the data center based out of New Orleans. So in addition to Katrina's transformation of the New Orleans region, Katrina was also transformative in how we think about climate adaptation and housing in this entire country. Certainly we all saw the poor U.S. emergency management response and the disparities in long-term recovery and near lack of any preparations and mitigations that preceded that. But there was a legacy of racism and wealth disparity in these public services that we may have thought of as neutral that certainly played out in the Katrina era. The Katrina also brought to light our ailing U.S. infrastructure, mainly because of the sea gates that fell and caused so much of the damage in the lower Ninth Ward. It also heightened our perceptions of the magnitude and unprecedented nature of new exposures due to climate. In many ways, it also unfortunately created the precedent that our climate adaptation policy in this country is based on disaster policy. Our study focuses on the challenges, inequities, and opportunities for making existing housing and households in the greater New Orleans area more prepared, less vulnerable to environmental hazards and disasters, particularly those due to acute and chronic effects of climate change. Now, all the dimensions of housing adaptation that we will be discussing today have evolved significantly since we started the study, since we even finished the data collection, the major data collection in our study, which ended during the pandemic. So let me quickly update you all, if you're not already glued to your news feed like I am, and waiting for the multiple shoes of political, policy, market, and household behaviors to drop. Just in the last 2 years alone, we have seen current debates about how to assess risk in the housing markets, in some cases causing panics in some circles because of the lack of consistent and aligned policy that makes sure our homes are better prepared for what is ahead. There's also been a proliferation of risk information sources and media reporting, often adding confusion for home buyers and renters and existing homeowners without always illuminating strategies that those households could use to occupy the current homes in more extremely exposed areas. On a daily basis, we also are seeing from California to Florida, the percolating in what is often the first real signal of change to households. Those are the insurance stories of premium increases, coverage decreases, or in some most dire of circumstances, lack of access to insurance altogether. Consequently, we're seeing advocacy around the kinds of information that can be made available to households prior to facing that kind of insurance sticker shock. News stories about risk information disclosures have been popping up in every part of the country. We will be experiencing this debate over risks and its ensuing overwhelming nature in the next few years. More importantly, we will be seeing these stories play out very differently for very different segments of the housing population, between owners and renters, between low, moderate, and high-income households, and between white communities and communities of color that retain the scars of racism and segregation today. This is not exactly news to many folks in places like Florida after Hurricane Andrew in 1992, or certainly in Louisiana after Katrina, who have found that their housing and the infrastructure meant to protect residential communities have been in limbo, along with those systems' risk assessment and mitigation tools, and all the services associated with those since these catalyzing events. This story goes back even further. There are precedents for how our housing institutions consider environmental risks today. The Great Mississippi River flood of 1927 inundated 16 million acres from Louisiana up to Illinois, displacing nearly 640,000 people, predominantly African Americans. In Vicksburg, Mississippi alone, the river swelled to 80 miles wide. Damages from this flood led private insurers to conclude that insurance against the peril of flood cannot successfully be written. This eventually led to the creation of the National Flood Insurance Program 40 years later, which aims to control the cost of post-disaster relief to the federal government and to motivate state and local governments to restrict building in high-risk areas. And certainly, insurance is one of a handful of tools at the disposal of households in already existing homes. The state of all these tools and their evolution at these critical tipping points started us on this journey for this project. It is a study of this evolution that our team of researchers proposed to the National Academy of Sciences Gulf Research Program to explore key dimensions of housing risk and, more importantly, opportunities for housing resilience. That work was funded and began in 2017, which is another important timing note because 2017 coincided with the first wave of major public policy changes that occurred as a consequence of the effect of Hurricane Sandy in New York City. But it was the same year that Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico and Hurricane Harvey hit Houston, and that the Thomas Fire occurred in California. So this study also provided us the chance to then look at the 10 years of transformation and turmoil in our specific site, the greater New Orleans area, following the devastation of Katrina and the still unprecedented quantity of federal and state investments that were sent to the region. New Orleans is one of the few cities that are now popularly conceived of as being the harbinger, the omen, the canary in the coal mine. The risk of extreme precipitation, of flooding risks that you see in the left and middle slides on the screen were a key reason for picking this site. But we were also very conscious of the region's housing history, one of racial and income segregation and disparities in housing quality, housing protections, and as Katrina demonstrated, infrastructure and service protections for different residential communities. These histories are inextricably tied to environmental change in southeastern Louisiana. So working with local community partners, we defined the greater New Orleans housing market as the metro areas encompassing 7 parishes. Our focus at the time in New Orleans involved looking, like I said, at all of the various tools at hand for existing households living in existing housing. But discussions with our local partners focused primarily on what current residents could do. And so with all that review of Louisiana and New Orleans housing, demographic, infrastructure, and environmental history, and in addition to looking at the scholarship on disaster and climate vulnerability that come from the disciplines of sociology, geography, and environmental justice, we came up with the definition for housing resilience that involves capacity to withstand, adapt, and thrive in the face of disaster, chronic and acute climate event, or environmental shock. We narrowed this down with the help of our partners to 6 key critical dimensions. And of those, I'll review very quickly the 6 of them, but we'll only be focusing on 2 today. The 6 of them include infrastructure funding and their outcome performance in terms of where what they're available, which resources, which communities were able to be protected from them, the levels of community engagement and participation in relationship to urban planning and the decision-making in the infrastructure world. Certainly, we know that there are a wide number of policies and plans that were developed in the post-Katrina era in the New Orleans region. Third, risk perception that we borrowed from psychology and behavioral economics. Property risk information, which I'll be speaking about more today. Insurance purchase and disparity in risk management that my colleague, Dr. Solari, was speaking to, and structural mitigations at the actual household level. So things like elevation, storm proofing, storm shutters, et cetera. Now, places like New Orleans have obviously reached tipping points where other considerations are at play. In particular, I want to point out 2 areas that we did not delve into in this study. One is the demography of renters, particularly because of the fact that renters aren't necessarily given a lot of information, and so about their housing choices at the time in the state of Louisiana. Happy to talk more about that, but I would definitely refer you to the work that is being done by the National Low Income Housing Coalition, and that work that I have done with the Enterprise Community Partners, some of which is published at the Brookings Institution. A second issue that we do not, of these dimensions that we do not include, is our land use restrictions and reform, particularly because, again, we're looking at existing housing within the region. So for that work, I highly recommend that when you turn to Dr. Miyuki Hino's work in North Carolina that has looked at the effects of the challenges that still lie ahead of us for land use restrictions. But again, today we'll be focusing on 2 of these dimensions: disparities in the source and use of risk information, and insurance coverage, pricing, and treatment. Just to give an overview about all the data that we use. So we certainly relied on a wide range of data sources. The study, and you can see this in the report itself, relied on both qualitative and quantitative methods, as well as data collection. We did about interviews and focus groups with over 140 individuals, and this included federal, state, and local government officials, local activists in the housing world, and actual residents. They were particularly helpful in developing the survey instrument that I'll be talking about. We relied on a wide range of secondary sources, including national demographic information, but also things like FEMA flood maps. And of course, we had to rely on very specific proprietary property level transaction data within the 7 parish areas in which we were looking at. What we are particularly proud of was a survey that we developed of post-Katrina home buyers conducted with our local partners that use multiple modes, utilizing a range of experimental incentive and recruitment techniques. And that included data collection during the early months of the pandemic shutdown. This is a multi-year survey fielding that included several months during at the beginning of the pandemic shutdown. We're very proud of this for all of that because of the level of effort that was associated with it, but also because there are virtually no non-proprietary sources of insurance information at the household level, especially survey insurance information that can be matched directly to household demographic perception and actions. So at the end of the day, we could certainly answer in Q&A additional questions about how we did the survey and the experimentation. I know Dr. Solari led much of that experimentation. I'm sure she'd be happy to talk more about it. But at the end of the day, we had a final sample of about 952 completed survey responses representative of the region. So let me get into the issue of the risk information. In this category, particularly in the survey, the kinds of questions we asked were about the content of risk information. So those are things like whether people were told about previous flooding to the home that they were looking at, hurricane or fire damages, the home's flood zone location, seller's repairs, any seller's flood insurance that they wanted to communicate to the buyer, flood elevation certificates, liens or other requirements on homes because of past repair programs, just a wide range. All of the content that I'm speaking about, coincidentally, are part of the now Louisiana property disclosure requirements. So, which brings me to the second thing we asked about with relationship to risk information, and that is the sources of all that content. Where do they get these sorts of information? And certainly we ask about documentation from the sellers or seller's representative, which involves the Louisiana property disclosure statement. We asked about verbal comments from the real estate agents, from sellers or neighbors. We asked about online resources. These are the things like multiple listing services, as well as Realtor.com, Zillow, Redfin, et cetera. Those kinds of information sources that many home seekers use. And then public records, things like public flood maps that FEMA made available, or local government records, as well as inspection reports from during the home purchase process, the building inspection. So of all of those, we also asked about the current information sources as they were purchasing the home, as well as any new information sources that they developed about risk and information after they had purchased the home. Things like additional new family and friends, media sources, internet sources, et cetera, about the risk information. And I get a little more into detail about the survey questions, but let's get into a little bit more of the context here. Now, I mentioned Louisiana's property disclosure statement. It's important that we give you a sense of what was going on here, because Louisiana has been viewed as the gold standard of property risk disclosures, particularly around flood risk, in the post-Katrina era, through a series of state legislative acts that occurred after Katrina. So we were curious, does actually including all this information in property disclosures in relationship to the range of other media sources and information sources that a home buyer may be accessing, did it make a difference in their decision-making process? We also clearly relied on the literature about how information that is provided regarding any kind of environmental risk or climate-related risk matters in housing, how that process of informing is as important in how it's practiced and not just how it's officially regulated. And also that the variable distribution of the sources of information and the usage of that information by different types of groups, because our core questions throughout all of the research all 6 dimensions of the study around inequities by race and income and a range of other factors. So the core research questions for this specific project were this specific dimension of the project were around whether groups received different amounts and quality of information about the risks associated with a home when they were purchasing it, and whether they acted differently on that information. Now, for background, it's important to note that there was a bell-shaped distribution regarding the number of sources that homebuyers may have relied upon. The most common source of risk information was number one during home selection was inspection reports. Number two was verbal communications from real estate agents, and then documentation from sellers, including the disclosure statements, and then property records and zoning maps. Almost half, about 46% of the home buyers did not consult disclosure statements much or at all, despite Louisiana's gold standard disclosure laws. Now, there were notable differences in information sources when we look at different kinds of groups. So you're looking at the share of different household groups. So the light blue is there are various categories of group and variables related to those categories of groups. And on the dark gray, you're looking at different sources of risk information or the sources used to some extent or a great extent. So this is what people actually said that they used. And as you can see, higher income households, those with annual incomes of $90,000 or more, and households that bought their homes of a higher value, $200,000 or more, used the key formal information sources to some or a great extent at significantly higher rates than their lower income or households that purchase lower valued properties did. 4.8 percentage points higher for disclosure statements in particular when we're talking about income level. Just as telling is what home buyers said that they relied upon are what they said they didn't rely upon at all. In this slide, you'll see the share of homeowners who replied not at all to relying on disclosures. This is that one specific source of information about their home's risks. As you can see, and I recall that I said that almost half, 46% of all home buyers said that they did not consult disclosure statements much or at all. So this is only the not at all category, and broken out by the same demographic factors that we discussed earlier. Many lower income households, about 39%, did not use disclosures. And this is a pattern that we find again among the households that eventually purchased lower priced homes and those with lower educational attainment. I should note, I want to make sure I make this disclaimer about our income variables, that they're less than ideal. Because of our instrument, because in our instrument, we requested income ranges. We were forced to make a blunt cutoff between lower and upper income households at about $90,000 annual income. So we may be actually washing out some even deeper significant differences among lower income households. So one final note on information not being utilized that we found that was surprising was that when we look at households that eventually did purchase homes in the flood zone, which is where risk should have been apparent, there were still differences. The share of households, what you're seeing are the share of households not receiving select information, so the same range of information sources on previous damage during home selection, but broken out between those that are in flood zones and those that purchase homes outside of the flood zone. And nearly 1 in 5 households in the flood zone reported not receiving any information about their home's flood risk status during home selection. So policies that require that risk information be shared are not necessarily being implemented well. More importantly, receiving risk information does not necessarily translate into making decisions or taking action to mitigate that risk. Our findings, I should say, are by no means meant to deter the policy changes regarding seller disclosures that have been playing out over the last decade. If anything, they suggest that more information communicated more accessibly will likely lead to better results. But we also know that even with the proliferation of accessible information, some households simply have no choice but to take riskier homes. A range of reasons may be occurring there beyond information and availability of information. There could be denial of risk. Other housing preferences, such as location in relationship to schools and work, playing out more at a higher priority than the climate risk. There could be personal associations with specific neighborhoods and histories of families. And simply the fact that in this country, low-income people and people of color have been relegated to live in certain places. So once they moved to new places, let's look at what played out after they moved in. And to that note, I will pass the mic to my colleague, Dr. Solari.
Carlos, did you want to first do the context? Next slide.
Sorry. Here we go. Just tell me when you want to move, and I'll just say next slide.
Okay. So insurance policies and premiums are generally based on actuaries' models of estimated risk. But this has not always been the case for general property insurance like homeowners policies or for hazard insurance. Previous studies suggest that possible racial disparities existed decades ago, but have since diminished, while others suggest that having flood insurance in pre-Katrina New Orleans varied by demographic characteristics. And it's still unclear if disparities in insurance coverage and pricing exist by financial capacity. In Louisiana, for example, insurance quotes can factor in the policyholder's credit scores. So homeowner and hazard insurance remains a primary risk mitigation tool for housing and a critical housing resilience strategy, but it is increasingly less accessible. Both insurance types are becoming more unaffordable to many households. So key questions we investigated here were, do different groups receive different insurance policies and premium rates? And are they treated differently in claims transactions? Let's go to the next slide. So as a reminder, when we asked respondents to take the survey, we specifically asked them to access their insurance information. And our goal with that was to have more accurate information and less missing data. And the results here are also based on weighted data that are representative of homeowners in the region. So we asked respondents what losses were covered for specific events across all their insurance policies. And over 97% of respondents were covered by loss due to fire. 94% had covered losses due to hurricane or windstorm. And about 83% have losses from flood due to a natural disaster covered. Next slide. So here we have some logit models that, and the results we're showing are the odds ratios. And the highlighted figures with stars represent the coefficients that are statistically significant. So our models focus on whether race and ethnicity and income predict the level of insurance coverage for three kinds of hazards: flood due to a hazard event, hurricane or windstorm, and all perils combined. And we're controlling for location, sociodemographics, and having a past hazard experience. What we find is when we take these variables into account, race ethnicity does not significantly predict the level of insurance policy coverage, but income is more predictive. So homeowners with higher household incomes are over 6 times more likely to be covered for hurricane or windstorm losses compared to those with lower incomes. And higher income households are also twice as likely to have coverage for all perils or losses compared to those with lower incomes. And we earlier saw that only about 6% of respondents reported having no coverage for damage from hurricane or windstorms, but nearly all of those are lower income households that lack the coverage. It is reassuring to see something we would expect, that homeowners residing in a FEMA designated 100-year flood zone are 5 times more likely to have an insurance policy that covers flood damages from a disaster event. Just note that neither race, ethnicity, nor income levels predict flood coverage. This is most likely because NFIP leveled the playing field and made flood insurance more accessible. So that's also reassuring. It's also worth noting that those who reported having gone through a hazard experience in the past are 2 times more likely to have hurricane and wind losses covered. Next slide. We did ask respondents to look at their annual flood insurance premiums. their homeowners insurance premiums, and then the highest value deductible across all their policies. So across all respondents, the median annual homeowners insurance premium was about $2,300, and the median annual flood insurance premium was about $500. The median annual flood insurance premium for respondents within a flood zone was $747 compared to $475 for respondents outside of a flood zone. And when looking at the highest value deductible across all policies, the median highest deductible was about $2,600. And we find that higher income respondents reported having higher deductibles as well as homeowners and flood insurance premiums. And we found that white non-Hispanic respondents also have higher deductible and homeowners insurance premiums. But for flood insurance, households of color are reported to have slightly higher annual flood insurance premiums. Next slide. So we can see this in a regression model. These results are focusing on race, ethnicity, and income, controlling for location, sociodemographics, and items related to other insurance behavior and mitigation actions. So we'll focus on those highlighted figures that are statistically significant. So here we find that higher income households pay significantly more for their annual homeowners insurance premium by about $290 compared to lower income households, but the coverage limit is significantly higher by $27,000. And as a reminder, coverage limits are the maximum amount of money an insurance company will pay for a covered claim. That means that every dollar spent in annual premium translates to $93 in added coverage for higher income households. Households of color pay significantly less, about $250 than white non-Hispanic households, but they have significantly lower coverage, about $41,000 less than white non-Hispanic households. So even though households of color are paying less annually for their premiums, every dollar they pay less translates to $161 less in coverage. We saw no statistically significant differences in race or income in predicting flood insurance premiums. And the model predicts with statistical significance that homeowners located in a flood zone pay on average $433 more for their flood insurance premiums than homeowners located outside of the flood zone, controlling for other factors. Next slide. We also explored claims outcomes. In the survey, we asked respondents to reflect on the most significant claim in their lifetime and to describe the outcome of that claim. So one thing to note is that really only a small share of respondents reported ever filing a claim, but of those who did, 83% reported that those were fully paid or mostly paid. Higher income households reported higher levels of payment outcomes for their claims compared to lower income households, and about 86% versus 79% for lower income households. And white households have had their reported claims paid in full or mostly paid at a higher rate than households of color, about 88% compared to 73%. Next slide. Among those who had claims, we looked at the type of service and level of satisfaction as it related to the respondent's most significant claim they filed in their lifetime, as well as their overall satisfaction with their current homeowners insurance among all of those with insurance. So we look at whether race or income predicts the level of service, controlling for location, sociodemographics, and other controls like insurance shopping frequency, other coverage and claims behavior and outcomes. And here we have claim time, and that refers to kind of a grouped number of months it took for the insurance provider to process that claim. And satisfaction is ranked from very dissatisfied to very satisfied on a 5-point scale. So these are results that are odds ratios from ordered logits. But we find that household income is positively associated with the quality of claims processing. So higher income households are significantly more likely to face shorter claim processing time and significantly more likely to have higher levels of satisfaction with their claim process. We also see that households of color are significantly less satisfied with their claims process. And we do have larger sample sizes on the homeowners insurance satisfaction, and we see households of color are significantly less likely to be satisfied compared to their white households. And we can advance to the next slide and I'll pass back to Carlos.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Solari. So before we wrap up and get a response from Dr. Kousky, I do want to note, like the earlier presentation the earlier slide that I showed about the levels of information sources, the range of policy actions that are happening at the local level aren't all about causing confusion. So we want to be clear that there is some positive steps moving forward. So let me go through a couple of those positive things that have occurred. Certainly in places like the state of New Jersey, their property disclosures include rental properties now, and not just disclosures for from home sellers to home buyers. We're seeing major efforts at the local level to improve infrastructure and be very sensitive to lower income communities and communities of color in places like Miami, with the Miami-Dade County pushing back on the Army Corps of Engineers plans for the Miami Bay. We see in Texas a major bond effort, such as the Harris County Stormwater District Bond, the quote unquote Harvey bond, that is particularly focused on making sure that lower income households benefit from those programs. A lot of this is funded by FEMA's Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities work as well. We also see that in many cases, there is a great opportunity there's a larger opportunity in places like Louisiana for homes to receive assistance to do individual property mitigation strategies. Some of this now is tied into the Institute for Building Home and Safety's Fortified Homes program. There's much more opportunity due to executive order, presidential executive order, to make sure communities are engaged in the planning processes through Justice 40 requirements, through Thriving Communities, TA, et cetera. And certainly there is a change in perception. There's a growing acknowledgement, particularly among certain segment of buyers, that their risk is among, and certainly among folks that have housing choices, that climate risks and any kind of environmental hazard risk and exposure is factored into their decision-making processes. We're also awaiting additional federal program rules, including the Federal Flood Risk Management Standard, which will require a greater level of flood protection for new construction and substantial home rehabilitation for a range of federally funded housing. And maybe the first significant shoe among all those shoes I discussed earlier that will be dropping. This is now a very dynamic space. So our findings are not indicative of the current time or near future. As I said, it's a very dynamic space, but at least we get to provide lessons for the contemporary housing climate transitions that are afoot across the country. We are also grateful for being able to contribute to that conversation. So I want to close off by making sure we acknowledge, again, the National Academy of Sciences Gulf Research Program, who, through much patience during the pandemic, allowed us to continue our data collection. To the entire research team, you'll see the name of all the staff that are on that report cover that you see on the right. To our 4 advisors, including Dr. Carolyn Kousky, who will be responding today, Professor Mary Camaria at UC Berkeley, Phil Burke out of North Carolina, and Dr. Marge Turner, formerly of the Urban Institute. There, we want to thank all the 140 plus federal, state, local officials, scholars, and community organizers throughout the region in Louisiana who helped us shape the study design as well as provide information for our analysis. And most importantly, we want to thank the partners who were integral, not just for helping us design and helping us reach out, but also actually doing data collection. We had significant, all of these partners played a significant role in actually running survey instrumentation and doing serving hotlines, et cetera, for the survey. This includes the Louisiana Fair Housing Action Center, Taproot Earth, formerly Gulf Coast Center for Law and Policy, the Louisiana Language Access Coalition, Mary Queen of the Vietnam Community Development Corporation, and the data center again. So in conclusion, we invite you to look at the report. You saw the links, and we will be putting up the links for the report as well as the actual data and the survey instrument. These are all open and accessible to anybody who wants to use them after they have been cleaned, obviously, of individual personal information. In the report, we have much more extensive discussions about the policy reviews. We actually provide research agendas for scholars in each of the 6 dimensions, and we review the very practical challenges that are ahead of us. For example, we're very conscious of the fact that of the cost implications of some of the mitigation actions and mandates from policies like the expected federal flood risk management standard. And again, those requirements are being placed on the housing market at a time right now of unprecedented housing unaffordability and underproduction nationally. But if it's one adage that I think our research supports, it is that we must start biting the bullet now. Otherwise, other bullets will kill us in the future. Thank you very much. And with that, we will be passing it back to David Lubroff.
Thank you, Carlos and Claudia. Just an incredible amount to dig into here in a limited time. But before we do that, or actually to start the process of digging in, we're very fortunate to have Carolyn Kousky with us, who, as Carlos said, served as an advisor on this project. Really, I gather from soup to nuts, and be interested in some of your observations of what struck you here, what confirmed what you already knew, and what were surprises, and anything else you want to share with us about that.
Great. Yeah, thank you. Thanks for inviting me to offer some comments. And I'd like to thank the authors for such a comprehensive and insightful report on a topic that's just growing, as we all know, in urgency and important. So in my 5 minutes, I just wanted to amplify and expand a bit on the topics of the study that you heard more about today and link those to some ongoing work that EDF is now doing around this growing insurance crisis that we're all aware of. So to start off, finding ways to get good information on climate risks to people is, of course, essential to be able to stem the rising tide of economic costs that we're seeing from climate change. And yet what the authors find in this report, and I think what we see emerge from several other studies as well, is that we're not doing such a great job at that currently. Louisiana, as the authors note, has really good flood disclosure laws comparatively to other states nationwide. But as you saw in their findings, they found that despite this, many homebuyers don't even look at these disclosures. And while disclosures are obviously critical to ensure a baseline and that every buyer gets access to material information about a potential home, I think these findings in the studies suggest to me an important policy question that I hope we dig in on in the coming months and years, which is, can we be reliant on disclosures as our only or our primary approach to risk sharing information and educating market participants about risk? Or do we need to be starting to think about some other approaches? What would such complementary approaches be? One that I think falls out of their report is the importance of educating, supporting, and empowering the facilitators of housing transactions to do more risk education with their clients. And so that's, of course, real estate agents, insurance agents, lenders, and as the authors note as well, home inspectors. But I think too often many of these professionals might not see it as their job to educate and discuss climate risks. They might not know details about those risks for all the properties they're involved with all the time. They might be worried about negative impacts or being sort of adversely affected by doing more with their clients on this topic or being held liable for certain statements they make. So I think this is a really important area that we could dig in more with some stakeholder engagement and research and policy conversations and partnerships between and among those groups in the coming, as I said, months and years. We also need more focused efforts on how to close the income gap among all these outcome measures that the authors find. They, as you heard, find that higher income households are more likely to have access to all types of information. But as we know, that can lead to trapping those with the least ability to weather the financial shock of a disaster in the highest risk areas. And so we need to identify urgently the tools to make sure that doesn't happen. Could the insurance sector do more around risk information and education? I think yes. In the report, the authors find that roughly half of respondents did get information from their insurer. In work I have with a colleague at Freddie Mac, we found in some of our own survey work that insured households often rely on their insurance company post-disaster for information on risk education. And when you take these results together, I think it suggests the need for insurers to indeed engage more deeply here, perhaps with regulator or other NGO support, to more directly inform their clients and support them on how to actually go about lowering their risk and adopting mitigation measures, particularly during the claims process. And there's certainly a continued need for more transparency from our federal flood insurance program. Right now, too many potential buyers don't know about possible flood insurance premiums until near closing, and they're never told important things like, is this property repetitive loss or about to be repetitive loss? And we know that creates economic inefficiencies in the housing and mortgage markets and can lead people to make suboptimal decisions and end up in high-risk places they wouldn't have if there had been more market transparency. Another point at this intersection of risk information insurance is how premiums are going to increase as the planet warms, right? We know the risks of storms and floods are only growing, which is going to translate into higher insurance costs. But potential buyers and renters are not told about how risk is changing and what that's going to mean financially for them over the time they spend in the structure. The NFIP, and there's been a lot of attention to this, has released aggregate data about how rates are increasing from their new pricing mechanism, Risk Rating 2.0. But what's not discussed is that those rising rates are only to get homes in line with the risk as of adoption of Risk Rating 2.0. It says nothing about the ongoing increases in flood risk and flood insurance premiums that are going to have to play out to reflect changing risk due to climate. And we know there's nothing disclosed to residents about rising homeowner rates, which unfortunately Louisiana has really been suffering from. Companies and regulators tend not to want to discuss that until they're actually going into effect. But we need that information to make important decisions about where to develop and how we build. And the only way out of this kind of crisis we're seeing right now is lowering risks through more transformative investments in climate adaptation to create communities that can be climate safe despite this. So I'll end now. In closing, I just wanted to highlight just one last topic discussed by the authors, which is how to create more inclusive markets to improve equity and recovery. As you heard, they found that lower income households are less likely to have insurance, despite being those who need it the most often. They're more likely to have challenges with claims that lead to differential outcomes. Dr. Martin was a big help on a report that EDF put together, teeing up a range of the kind of policy, regulatory, and private sector changes to help make our disaster insurance market better meet the needs of those who aren't well served by it right now and help move towards a system that's more affordable, accessible, transparent, people-centered, and just. So hopefully this work can help set us in that direction. Thank you again for the opportunity to respond.
Thank you. Again, you've given us a huge amount to chew on. Claudia, you want to also, there she is. We have a huge range of questions, and they're still coming in, and we will get to some of them. I want to, Carolyn, I thought that you among the many really terrific points and questions you raised was this question of, can we be reliant on disclosures? I think any of us who've ever purchased a house, there's that moment in the closing when you're just, you'd sign just about it, they just keep putting pieces of paper in front of you and you keep signing them. So I'm wondering, maybe looking back at the research, what do we know about, do we know anything about what kinds of disclosures actually have tended to be effective, and how might they be applied in this, in this context? Carlos, I think that's probably for you, or perhaps, well, it's anybody. It's a jump ball. Who wants it?
Well, you mean in the kind of content that's conveyed?
Yeah, the sort of there's. I mean, it seems to me there's the question about who has what information, and then there's I think a set of really interesting findings about even people with insurance getting treated in very differential ways. That is a different policy question in my mind.
Yeah. I mean, I think the question, so around the different kinds of content in Louisiana, we didn't do an analysis around whether each of the different specific contents led to disparities and sort of usage, that because we included everything that would be in a property disclosure as the content that we were asking about. So in theory, everybody's given a disclosure when they're purchasing a home from the seller. That's state law in Louisiana. It's state law in most places. There actually varies that level of disclosure by state, which is an important thing to take note of. But I would say the question probably speaks to the fact of what would actually make somebody make a decision that's included in their disclosure. So the 11 things that are currently in the Louisiana property risk disclosure that are flood related include things like if NFIP is required, if National Flood Insurance Program, if you have to have a flood insurance, if you had a flood certificate, if it's been elevated, if you have a flood elevation certificate, all the things that I mentioned before. But things like what your insurance premium will be are not part of the disclosure conversation, right? And those kinds of signals may actually be more effective when people realize, oh, there's a risk that's associated with this house, but this is what's actually going to mean to me when I take over this house. These are going to be the costs of home ownership for this specific home. Redfin did a very interesting study last year where they looked at comparative, it was a controlled experiment looking at folks that were looking at extremely at homes with extreme hazard risk. And we're actually then the control group was not given information about additional risk. The groups that were looking at homes with high exposure were then told, the treatment group was told, these are high risk homes, and they started looking at lower moderate risk homes. They didn't see the difference for people who were looking at moderate risk homes, making alternative decisions, right? So a lot of it is how we're defining the risk. So I feel like it's the money trigger that may be more effective ultimately. The thing is, that's not included. That's not a required disclosure for most states, that you tell how much the current homeowner is spending in utility rates, in home ownership, and a variety of hazard insurance policies.
Do we know, your comments make me wonder, what do we know, or what do we think we know about the price differentials between houses in flood zones in places like New Orleans and elsewhere? That at least my economist friends would say that this is something that the market should have taken into account in the pricing.
Mm-hmm. That's right. I think Dr. Carolyn Kousky wrote the book on this. If you want to talk about the valuation study, actually, when I was at the beginning of the presentation, when I was floating the different things that have occurred, the very first thing I showed was the study that Dr. Kousky was involved with. So I don't know if you want to talk about overvaluation, Dr. Kousky.
Sure, yeah, I'll say quick words. First, there's a very large body of research now that does find, exactly to your point, that the value of homes in the FEMA flood zones are selling for less on average than those outside. And that's probably some combination of the insurance requirement and the cost of that and the risk associated with it. But what we find, to kind of bring that back to this disclosure conversation in the more recent work led by a colleague at EDF, is that there's actually a lot of unpriced flood risk in the market right now. And so the way we look at that is to compare estimates of future flood damage. And if you discounted those back to present dollars and incorporated them into the price, what would you expect to see? And we don't see in the market that properties are discounted by as much as those projected future damages. But where that's really true is outside the FEMA floodplain, because there are so many areas exposed to flood risk that aren't mapped by FEMA. And one of the biggest is rainfall related flooding, which is just not included in the maps. So while we have great disclosures in the floodplain, we're often not disclosing important risk to other folks who are still exposed to the flood hazard, which I think, creates these inefficiencies in the market as well. I'll just highlight the point about needing to get to financially material disclosures for potential buyers. And this point about not knowing your flood insurance premium, I think, is a really big one. And I can kind of get on a soapbox about it, because since we have one federal flood program by a federal agency with one price set nationwide, it's trivial in terms of just actually doing it, but not in terms of the sort of politics of it, to have an online lookup tool where you could just put in any property and get their flood insurance premium. And that would be so helpful for people, but we don't do it.
I think this is a question for Claudia. The presentation focused on two of the 6 areas that you that the study looked at, and one of the last one in that list was what do homeowners actually do in terms of making their homes more resilient, and that strikes me as yet another piece, obviously, of the puzzle. If I was informed and I still bought in, in an area, presumably I might want to try and do something about it. So I don't know if there are some key findings from that part of the study that are worth highlighting, again, as we think about how people use or don't use information.
Well, I'll start with one thing and then maybe pass it to Carlos, because we did try to tie in some mitigation actions into the realm of insurance and behaviors. So what we found were that folks who actually took a mitigation action for their home had longer claims times compared to those who didn't. And they also had lower claim satisfaction rate. And we kind of suspect that, those homeowners who made these investments thought that, they would have gotten maybe more coverage for the claims that they filed, and so are finding themselves kind of less satisfied with their outcomes.
Is the supposition there that I had a negative outcome, and therefore I was more likely to take steps because I don't ever want to be in that again, or I took steps and I still wound up with a negative outcome, or we don't know?
Yeah, that's a good point. We don't exactly have all of the timing aligned to be so predictive.
Yeah, and maybe your question, David, is like if the bigger point is that I did these things to my house with the assumption that I would have these outcomes in insurance. And let me repeat, our study was done before the state of Louisiana started encouraging the use of IBHS as fortified home in the state. So there was a small pool, and you could read in the report the specific state incentives, which were very underutilized. Which included like tax holidays for purchasing storm shutters and that sort of thing. Very few elevation incentives other than FEMA, the buyouts and rare elevation programs. So overall, the amount of mitigation that was occurring, to answer the original question you had, was not a lot. And that was a part of the big problem, that even in the post-Katrina era, there was still very little mitigation being done, other than things like the building code, which tends to only affect new construction with a smaller subset of homes that have to go through gut rehab that meet 50%, the FEMA 50% threshold. But the reality is that primarily doesn't affect most existing housing. So most people aren't doing it. So when they did do it, they assumed that they were going to get all these benefits. Ideally, what we're seeing now in the post fortified home era is that people are making those investments and seeing the rewards in terms of lower insurance premiums and higher coverage.
Yeah, and we also did look at both like preparedness behaviors as well as mitigation efforts to the home. And like Carlos was saying, very few were actually doing any substantive mitigation behaviors, but more folks were engaging in the preparedness actions. Those are much less expensive and less time-consuming efforts to partake in.
And by preparedness, these are things like having your evacuation route, having your bag of documents and important papers and that sort of thing that you're going to leave very quickly with, that sort of thing.
I'm going to let us run over by just a couple minutes, because there's at least one other question that strikes me as really important. And this in part goes back to a point you were making, Carlos, about the study is a snapshot in time, and things are rapidly changing. But there have been a couple questions about the way the insurance market has been changing, and particularly around lapsed insurance. And so I'm wondering, I guess, one, if any one of you would sort of want to talk about what's been happening with premiums. One of the questions talked about the global insurance and property casualty insurance collapse, in sort of 2018, 2020, a little bit after your study. So what is the insurance, what's your sense of what the insurance market looks like right now? And at least anecdotally, what are you seeing in terms of its impacts, and how might that change some of the findings? Presumably, if premiums are in fact going up.
Right. I'm going to pass the mic to Dr. Kousky, but I do want to say that there was a bit of a collapse after Hurricane Katrina in Louisiana, right? This happened in Florida after Hurricane Andrew. It happened just 2 years ago in the state of California when two major the two largest homeowners insurance insurers threatened to pull out of the state, right? So this happens after these severe events, is that there's this sort of wariness about what the world is going to portend in the future. So so some of our study only it includes that context, right? That there was a bit of a collapse after Katrina, and so we started developing our instrument for home buyers after 2008, knowing that there was a lot of that confusion occurring. So the stabilization of it. So I guess the core of the question is are we going back to instability across the country? And that I will pass to Dr. Kousky.
Sure, thanks. And I think that's a really good point, Carlos, that after major disaster events, you also often see this hard market condition in insurance markets. And that goes back, many decades. What I think is concerning the last few years is that what we might be seeing is a type of market destabilization that's not just a post-disaster adjustment where we're going to see an influx of new capital and things will kind of calm back down, because there's now a concern that we are in an era of escalating risk and have not built safely enough for that risk. And so that is not going to, it's not coming back down, right? It's getting worse. And what we've seen the past few years is insurer insolvencies. Hotspot of this has been Louisiana and also Florida. We've seen much higher prices all around the country. And that's actually a little bit of a perfect storm, because it's also driven, and you'll see these prices like around the country, due to higher costs to rebuild, due to the prior inflationary environment, due to supply chain disruptions, due to labor market shortages. Some of that should start to unwind and get better. But in the areas of the hot spots of climate risk, it's even worse, right? Like double-digit price increases. And Southern Louisiana is one of those places. But we're seeing similar dynamics, like I said, across the Gulf Coast, Florida, Texas, and the wildfire-prone regions of California, of course, have also been seeing this. And that's creating a lot of challenges for public sector programs, because we have state level insurance programs for folks who can't find coverage in the voluntary market. And those are now coming under increasing amounts of stress as people just can't find coverage. And this then circles back nicely to all the conversations about encouraging more investments in risk reduction and mitigation, because really the only way to kind of restabilize markets is to really bring down the risk levels to insurable levels again.
Buddy, I don't know if you want to weigh in at all on that, or we do try to keep these to an hour. We've got a wealth of terrific questions. I know that we will be sharing them with Carlos and Claudia and Carolyn, and they may yet reach out to some of you. There's some really terrific questions and points. I just want to thank you for a slightly terrifying, but also I think fascinating and really important. And I try and come up with a pithy way to end this, but I'm actually going to steal Carlos's, because I thought that really emphasized it, that this is really the full report, by the way, is astonishing. I was reviewing it this morning, and those of you online, I really encourage you to dig into it. It also includes answers to some questions about methodology that a few of you raised. And I think in the end, when you read the full report, you come out again where Carlos said, which is, what was it? We have to bite the bullet now, because otherwise the bullets are gonna kill us later. We know what risk is being taken, and we really have to address it. So I want to thank you for highlighting that for us, for doing it in a way that really was understandable, and for just doing terrific work. And as Carlos said at the beginning, I'm sure we will have, I know we'll have Carlos back at some point in the Housing Research Seminar, and Carolyn and Claudia, I hope we will find opportunities to include you as well. And so I hope all of you online will join me in thanking Carolyn and Claudia and Carlos for a terrific presentation. And everybody have a great afternoon and a great weekend.
Thanks, everyone.